The extraordinary rise of a young military visionary. When the military establishment tells you that you lack sufficient age and experience to lead an entire division, most officers would simply accept the situation. They'd probably wait patiently for several more years to pass before earning that kind of authority. Perhaps they'd work quietly within the system, building seniority through conventional means. James Maurice Gavin, however, was not the type of officer who accepted limitations quietly. When he reached 37 years old and became the youngest division commander since the American Civil War, plenty of senior voices expressed serious doubts. They said he was too inexperienced, too fresh, too untested for such enormous responsibility. They couldn't have been more wrong about what they were witnessing. What they were actually observing was the emergence of a genuine military innovator, a commander who would fundamentally transform the entire nature of airborne operations. Before the war ended, this same young general would oversee the surrender of more than 150,000 German soldiers. He would become legendary, earning the nickname that would follow him throughout his career and into history itself. His path began in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. Born on March 22, 1907, in Brooklyn, New York, this future military genius entered the world as the son of Catherine Ryan, an Irish immigrant who had recently arrived in America. But his early life took a turn that might have derailed anyone else completely. When the boy was approximately 2 years old, he was brought to the Convent of Mercy Orphanage in Brooklyn. There he would remain, uncertain of his future, until 1909, when Martin and Mary Gavin, a family working in the Pennsylvania coal mines, decided to adopt him. The coal fields of Pennsylvania presented no easy existence for anyone, let alone a growing boy. His adoptive father worked as a coal miner, a profession that was dangerous and exhausting, leaving the family constantly struggling financially despite his tireless labor. The young boy understood early that life would demand personal effort and responsibility from him. At just 10 years old, he took on work as a newspaper delivery boy, learning the harsh truth that survival required taking action for yourself rather than waiting for others to provide. The moment that would eventually alter the entire course of American military history arrived in March 1924. The teenage boy, barely 17 years old, approached a sergeant in the United States Army recruiting office. He expressed serious interest in enlisting immediately. However, there existed a significant legal obstacle to his goal. Military regulations required that anyone under 18 years of age needed written permission from their parents or legal guardians before they could join. The young man confronted a difficult choice. He understood fully that his adoptive parents would never grant permission for him to enlist in the military. So he made a bold decision. He informed the recruiting sergeant that he was an orphan with no family to contact, no parents who could object to his enlistment. It was more than youthful rebellion or teenage impulsiveness. It represented the calculated risk of a young person who recognized that the military offered an escape route from the Pennsylvania coal mines, a pathway toward something larger than the life that had already claimed so much from his adoptive father. The transformation from an orphaned, street-smart teenager into someone who would revolutionize military science certainly did not occur overnight or through any single dramatic moment. After completing his basic military training, Gavin received assignment to Panama. It was here that he stumbled upon something that would essentially define the entire arc of his career and military thinking. He discovered books, and more importantly, he discovered how to educate himself through serious reading and study. While stationed in Panama, Gavin spent every spare moment he could find in the military library, reading voraciously. He particularly focused on works about great historical military commanders. One biography that especially captured his imagination and intellectual attention was the life story of Hannibal, the ancient general whose tactical innovations had challenged Rome itself. His fellow soldiers passed their time in entirely different ways. They gambled, played cards, drank alcohol, and sought entertainment wherever they could find it. This young private, by contrast, was conducting serious study of military history and strategic thinking. He engaged officers in conversations about military tactics and strategy that most enlisted men would never have considered discussing. This intellectual hunger and obvious aptitude did not escape the notice of his commanding officers. The senior military leadership recognized that they had an unusual soldier on their hands, someone whose mind was clearly suited for greater responsibility. The opportunity that emerged seemed almost impossible for someone with his background and circumstances. He was selected for admission to the United States Military Academy at West Point. For an orphaned boy who had worked in coal mining country, this represented an extraordinary achievement. When Gavin graduated from the academy in June 1929, almost nobody could have predicted the revolutionary impact he would eventually have on the entire nature of modern warfare. During the early portion of his career as a commissioned officer, the years were productive, but also somewhat frustrating for someone with Gavin's ambitions and intellectual drive. In 1933, Gavin received assignment to the 28th and 29th Infantry Regiments stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He had expressed clearly that he had no interest in becoming an instructor responsible for training new recruits. Despite this preference, he was assigned to duties that disappointed him professionally. Still, Gavin refused to waste the opportunity. He spent most of his available free time in what he himself described as the excellent military library at the fort. He pursued his reading and study with the same intensity that had always characterized his approach to learning. Certain military theorists particularly captured his analytical attention. The writings of J.F.C. Fuller especially fascinated him. When Gavin reflected on these works years later, he explained his attraction to Fuller's ideas. Fuller possessed the intellectual capacity to see clearly what modern warfare would actually require. He understood the profound implications of machines, weapons, gasoline, oil, tanks, and aircraft. Gavin consumed Fuller's writings with great energy and focused attention, absorbing these revolutionary concepts about the nature of future conflict. It was during an assignment to the Philippines, however, that Gavin's strategic thinking truly crystallized and matured into a coherent worldview about military innovation. In 1936, Gavin was posted to the Philippines. While serving there, he became increasingly concerned about the realistic capacity of the United States military to counter what he recognized as probable Japanese expansion plans. The American forces stationed in the region numbered approximately 20,000 soldiers, yet they were poorly equipped and inadequately prepared. Gavin observed their weapons and equipment with growing alarm. He would later remark that the military hardware available to these troops was no better than what had been used during the First World War, now more than a decade in the past. The implications of this realization struck him forcefully. America's military was not prepared for modern conflict. Traditional weapons and tactics would prove catastrophically inadequate against a technologically sophisticated enemy. This experience in the Philippines planted the seeds of his later revolutionary innovations regarding airborne operations. He came to understand that traditional military thinking, built on outdated assumptions about warfare, would not be sufficient to meet the challenges of modern threats. Newer, more imaginative approaches would be essential. When the United States entered World War II, Gavin recognized that his moment had finally arrived. He saw an opportunity to put his revolutionary ideas into practice. He volunteered immediately for the newly created Airborne Forces in 1941. He recognized with clarity that paratroopers represented the genuine future of military operations. not merely another infantry variation, but something entirely new. However, Gavin possessed ambitions that extended even beyond simply becoming a paratrooper and jumping from aircraft. He wanted to completely reimagine how airborne forces could be deployed and utilized. He wanted to think through the entire problem from first principles, considering not just how troops would jump, but how they could function most effectively once on the ground. One of Gavin's first priorities after entering the airborne forces was determining the most effective ways to actually deploy and utilize airborne troops. His initial action took the form of writing what became known as FM 31-30, a field manual addressing the tactics and techniques of airborne forces. This was far more than simply a manual describing procedures and rules. The document served as a complete blueprint for an entirely new approach to warfare. The manual contained detailed information about tactics that airborne units should employ. It addressed the proper organization of paratroopers within command structures. It specified what kinds of military operations airborne forces could successfully execute. It outlined exactly what equipment and resources would be necessary for these troops to accomplish their assigned missions effectively. Years later, when asked what factors had accelerated his military career so rapidly, Gavin would respond with a characteristically straightforward answer. He would say, quite simply, that he had written the book literally. He had essentially created the intellectual foundation upon which American airborne warfare would be built. His ideas would shape how this entirely new form of combat would develop throughout the war and for decades beyond. By August 1942, Gavin received command of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. At 35 years old, he was already demonstrating the qualities of leadership that would eventually make him legendary among military professionals. Yet it was his particular philosophy of leadership, his unique approach to commanding troops, that truly distinguished him from other officers in meaningful ways. Unlike the senior generals who commanded armies from comfortable headquarters, far removed from actual fighting, Gavin developed an approach that would become his signature style and defining characteristic. He led from the front lines, not from behind. He jumped into combat zones alongside his soldiers. This concept was absolutely revolutionary for its time, and it was also extraordinarily dangerous. Gavin would become known throughout the military as the Jumping General, a nickname that reflected his willingness to parachute into combat alongside the troops under his command during World War II. He was the only American general officer to make 4 combat jumps during the entire war, a fact that speaks volumes about his commitment to sharing the risks that his soldiers faced. This was not showmanship designed to impress observers or earn medals. It was a calculated strategic approach based on deep psychological understanding. Gavin recognized that when soldiers watched their commanding general voluntarily sharing the same risks, taking the same chances, sleeping in the same mud, their entire performance changed. Their commitment intensified. Their willingness to accomplish difficult missions increased. This physical presence by leadership had real tactical benefits beyond the symbolic value. Gavin's first major test of his leadership abilities came during Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. This operation would test everything he had learned about leading troops in combat. The parachute drop itself, however, turned into a disaster from the very beginning. When the transport aircraft released the paratroopers, they did not land anywhere near their intended drop zone. The discrepancy was not a matter of a few hundred meters. Strong winds buffeted the aircraft, and pilot error contributed significantly to the problem. Gavin's regiment was scattered across approximately 30 miles of Sicilian countryside. The soldiers were badly dispersed, separated from each other, uncertain of their exact location. What would have demoralized or paralyzed many commanders simply prompted Gavin to adapt. He gathered whatever troops he could locate and led them toward their assigned objective. The goal was the critical position known as Piazza Ridge, a sliver of defensible land that would prove essential to the success of the overall operation. Here we encounter perhaps the defining moment of Gavin's character as a commander. When the operation had already gone catastrophically wrong, instead of panicking or calling for retreat and reorganization, he adapted to the changed situation. He made the situation clear to every soldier under his command. His message was direct and unambiguous. No matter what circumstances they faced, no matter how badly the operation had gone, they would hold this position. They would not retreat. They would not surrender the initiative to the enemy. The defenders of Piazza Ridge demonstrated remarkable courage and tactical skill. They managed to capture several enemy pack howitzers, which they quickly converted into direct fire weapons to defend the ridge against attacking forces. One of these improvised weapons managed to knock out one of the attacking tanks. This was not merely military success measured in units captured. It represented a clear demonstration of Gavin's core leadership principle in action: adapt, improvise, and never surrender the initiative, no matter how badly circumstances have changed from what was planned. His soldiers did not follow orders simply because they were soldiers, and Gavin was their commander. They believed in him because he was right there with them, facing every danger personally, sharing every risk. When a general jumps into the same combat zone as his men, when he carries a rifle alongside them, when he fights beside them rather than directing from safety, it changes everything about how soldiers perform. The successful defense of the ridge in Sicily led directly to promotion for Gavin. On December 9, 1943, he was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. At the same time, he was assigned as the Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne Division. At only 36 years old, Gavin had become one of the youngest Army officers to achieve general rank during World War II. However, his greatest challenge and his most important test as a leader still lay ahead of him. The test would come on D-Day, during the operation that would fundamentally change the course of human history. On the night of June 5 into June 6, 1944, Gavin would lead the airborne spearhead of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. In the first C-47 transport aircraft carrying troops of the battle-tested 82nd Airborne Division, a slim and handsome officer peered through the window at the complete darkness outside. He waited impatiently for the signal to jump. Except for the pathfinders who had jumped approximately 1 hour earlier to prepare the drop zones, Brigadier General James Gavin, serving as deputy commander of the division, would be the very first man to parachute 10 miles behind the German defensive lines. The D-Day jump perfectly exemplified everything that Gavin believed about leadership and command. Elements of his regiment took the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and secured the critical river crossings on the flank of the Utah beach landing area. Success came not merely from the careful tactical planning that had been done beforehand, but from the profound psychological effect produced when soldiers saw their own commanding general literally leading the charge, arriving first, taking the greatest risks. August 1944 brought the moment that would ultimately define Gavin's entire legacy and historical significance. He became the youngest division commander since the Civil War ended nearly 80 years before. When he officially assumed command of the 82nd Airborne Division on August 8, 1944, and was subsequently promoted to the rank of Major General in October of that year, the military world took notice. At 37 years old, Gavin held a position that was typically reserved for men with many more years of service and considerably more experience. He was the youngest divisional commander in the entire Army since the Civil War. The criticism from senior officers was immediate and harsh. Veteran commanders questioned seriously whether someone so young could manage the complexity of commanding 15,000 men in combat situations. The whispers that circulated through Washington suggested that he was being promoted far too quickly, that combat leadership and divisional command were fundamentally different skills that required different types of experience. Gavin's response to this criticism was not defensive or apologetic. His response was decisive action. He would prove his critics wrong through performance, not through argument. His first major test in this new position came during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Montgomery had developed an ambitious plan that he believed could end the war by Christmas. The operation required airborne divisions to seize several key bridges across the waterways in the Netherlands. During the actual drop into the Netherlands, Gavin made a rough landing on hard pavement instead of soft grass, injuring his back in the process. The date was September 17, 1944, and Gavin fractured vertebrae in his spine during that jump. He did not report the injury. He did not seek medical treatment. Instead, he continued commanding his division throughout the entire campaign, leading his troops for nearly 2 months while managing the pain of serious spinal injury. This single decision perfectly encapsulated Gavin's entire leadership philosophy. The mission came first. Personal suffering came second. His soldiers would see their general continuing to lead, continuing to function, continuing to make decisions, regardless of his physical condition. It would have been easy to report the injury, to accept evacuation, to recover away from combat. Gavin chose differently. The 82nd Airborne's performance during Market Garden, despite the ultimate failure of the overall operation to achieve Montgomery's ambitious objectives, clearly vindicated Gavin's command abilities. Senior British commanders recognized his capabilities. After the fighting at Nijmegen, a visiting British general came to Gavin's command post. General Miles Dempsey, the skilled and unassuming commander of the British Second Army, told Gavin directly and personally that he was proud to meet the commanding general of what he considered the greatest division in the world at that time. However, it was during the Battle of the Bulge that Gavin truly proved his critics completely wrong and permanently established his reputation as one of America's finest military commanders. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive in December 1944, the 82nd Airborne was rushed into the fighting. Gavin was still recovering unknowingly from the spinal fractures that he had sustained months earlier at Nijmegen. The newly promoted Major General led the 82nd Airborne through the brutal Battle of the Bulge and into the final months of the war in Europe. His fractured discs in his back, never properly treated, continued to cause him pain throughout this period. Still, he led. Still, he commanded. Still, he functioned at the highest level required by his position. During this brutal winter campaign, we observe perhaps the most revealing aspect of Gavin's character as a human being and as a military leader. While he was busy managing the complex demands of leading thousands of American soldiers through savage winter warfare against a desperate enemy, Gavin continued to write letters. He found time to write personal notes to his young daughter Barbara, sending them from whatever location served as his command post, often from bombed-out buildings near the German-Belgian border. His responsibilities extended beyond military operations. In his mind, he felt a personal obligation to the families of soldiers under his command. When casualties occurred, when young men died in combat, Gavin understood that he carried a responsibility to communicate with their families. He would write personal letters to the mothers, fathers, and relatives of every soldier who had been killed. By this point in the war, the weight of that responsibility had created what he himself described as an awful heap of letters that required his attention. This was not administrative duty that could be delegated to an aide. This was moral leadership that Gavin felt obligated to assume personally. Each letter represented genuine thought and genuine effort on his part. The responsibility was enormous. Gavin understood that command meant bearing the emotional weight of every decision he made, every order he gave, every tactical choice that resulted in casualties. At 37 years old, he was carrying responsibilities that would have crushed many men older and more experienced than himself. Yet he carried them with apparent resolve. His personal habits during combat became legendary among the soldiers who served under him. Unlike most generals and most officers, Gavin carried a standard M1 Garand rifle as his personal weapon. This was the weapon that infantry soldiers carried, not the pistol or carbine that officers traditionally carried as their weapon of choice. When combat situations demanded it, he used that rifle in actual fighting alongside his men. Gavin was known for another characteristic behavior as well. Bad weather did not prevent him from visiting his troops. Enemy fire did not prevent him from moving to the front lines. His soldiers always knew, with absolute certainty, that he was with them. When necessary, he would crawl from one foxhole to another, checking on individual soldiers, ensuring they had what they needed, sharing their hardship. This physical courage that he demonstrated every day translated directly into moral courage in his command decisions. In an army that was still practicing racial segregation, where black soldiers were separated into all-black units in almost every case, General Gavin spoke out against segregation in the military. He drew significant attention to the problem of racial prejudice that existed throughout the military structure. This kind of stand required genuine personal courage, because it meant challenging the accepted practices of the entire institution. By May 2, 1945, the war in Europe was approaching its inevitable end. Yet James Gavin was about to achieve what many generals who were twice his age never accomplished during their careers. 6 days before victory was officially declared in Europe, Gavin accepted the formal surrender of the entire German 21st Army. This represented 150,000 German troops under his command authority. The 82nd Airborne Division had crossed a major river in company with the British 6th Airborne Division. Together, they had advanced approximately 36 miles in a single day of combat operations. In that single day, they captured over 100,000 enemy soldiers. The pace and scale of the operation was remarkable. Picture the scene that followed. A German general appeared, thin and exhausted, but still maintaining military bearing and dignity in field gray uniform. Red collar tabs and an iron cross at his throat indicated his rank and his history. This was General Kurt von Tippelskirch. He came to Gavin's command post asking specifically to speak with the American general in charge. The German general needed to discuss terms and arrange for the formal surrender of his forces. When the German general approached and saw Gavin, his reaction was immediate and barely concealed. Shock registered clearly on his face. Here stood before him a young American officer, barely in his 30s, accepting the surrender of an entire German army. The disparity between what von Tippelskirch expected and what he found was striking. Yet this moment represents more than a simple military victory, more than a tactical success measured in units captured and territory controlled. This moment validated everything that Gavin had fought throughout his career to prove to the military establishment. The fundamental principle was clear and undeniable. Youth, when combined with genuine intelligence and demonstrated courage, could achieve results that traditional military thinking had said were impossible. Leadership was not about age or seniority or time in service. Leadership was about earning the trust and respect of your men through shared sacrifice, through tactical brilliance, through being present when it mattered most. Gavin had proven this principle beyond any doubt. The influence of Gavin extended far beyond the conclusion of World War II. His innovations in airborne warfare became the intellectual foundation for modern special operations forces. His leadership philosophy, which emphasized leading from the front and sharing risks with your men, which stressed the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, became the gold standard for military command across all service branches. At the absolute pinnacle of his career, with promotion to 4-star general rank and the probable selection to become the Chief of Staff of the Army, Gavin suddenly announced his retirement from active service. The decision surprised many observers in Washington and throughout the military establishment. The underlying reason for his decision to end his illustrious military career was fundamentally bound up in his personal sense of honor and integrity. When Gavin disagreed with Army policies that he could not support in good conscience, he chose to resign rather than compromise his principles. He refused to continue serving in ways that violated his understanding of right action. Even in retirement, he remained true to the core principles that had made him legendary among soldiers. The orphaned boy from Brooklyn, who had lied about his age to join the Army at 17, had become one of America's greatest military leaders. His path had been impossible, yet he had walked it successfully. More importantly, James Gavin had proven something vital to the entire institution of military command. At moments of genuine crisis, when history demands extraordinary leadership, the age of the man or woman leading does not matter as much as the size of their courage and the genuine depth of their commitment to the soldiers under their command. Leaders matter. Character matters. When history needed a commander who could revolutionize the entire nature of warfare and inspire soldiers to achieve what seemed impossible, history found not a grizzled veteran who had spent decades climbing the promotion ladder. History found a young general, barely middle-aged, who understood in his bones that true leadership requires being the first to jump into danger and being the last to claim credit for the success that follows. James Gavin was deemed too young to command an entire division until he demonstrated conclusively that he was exactly the commander that America needed in that precise moment. His legacy endures today in every special operations mission conducted by American forces, in every airborne unit, in every leader who understands the true meaning of command, understanding that command is fundamentally about service to those under your authority, never about privilege or personal advancement. The boy who began with nothing, who grew up in orphanages and coal mining country, became the general who played a significant role in liberating Europe from tyranny. His life proved beyond any reasonable doubt that in America, courage and intelligence can overcome any obstacle placed in your path. That simple but powerful truth, the power of leading from the front, something that James Gavin understood clearly at 25 years old, was something that made him legendary by the time he reached 37.